The October wind cut across Salt Creek Valley, colder than Margaret Kellerman had expected. She stood on the porch, one arm wrapped around the single canvas bag she still owned, the other hand pressed against a sheet of paper folded and refolded so many times over 2 days of travel that it had softened at the creases. She held it up as Ezra Holcomb stepped out of the barn, his eyes settling on the handwritten line, "Seeking someone to keep house and mind a boy." "Let me stay," she said, steady, not pleading. "I'll care for your son." Ezra looked her over plainly, road dust on her skirt, a stranger at his door in the middle of his busiest hour. "What do you know about children?" he asked. "Caleb isn't easy to look after." "I've looked after myself since I was 12, she answered. "I know how to cook, how to keep a house, how to tell when a child's hungry and won't say so." "He doesn't say anything," Ezra said, almost a warning. "Not one word in 8 months." "Then I'll learn to understand him without words." He glanced past her to the empty road. "You're traveling alone?" "There's no one left to travel with." She said it plainly, the way a person says something too many times to let it hurt anymore. "I don't need wages, just a bed and a plate." "I'll do whatever needs doing, cooking, washing, minding your boy, anything." By the fence, a 6-year-old boy crouched alone, setting small stones in a row, never looking up, never taking his eyes off the corral gate. Ezra looked at his son, then back at the worn paper, his own handwriting, posted 2 weeks earlier. He didn't nod right away, but he didn't close the door either. Ezra didn't answer that afternoon. He walked back to the barn, leaving her to wait, and she did, until the boy by the fence rose at dusk and carried his stones inside in a small tin box. When Ezra came back, he found her still there. "There's a room off the kitchen," he said, not quite looking at her. "You'll have to make do." "I've made do with less," Margaret said, and followed him in. The house told her more than he had. Dust on the mantel, a wash basin gone cold since morning, a woman's shawl still hanging by the door, untouched in what looked like months. She said nothing about it. She hung her own coat elsewhere and set to work. Caleb ate supper in silence, one hand resting on his tin box the whole meal. When she set a second helping of beans in front of him, he didn't look up, but he ate them. She counted that as something. That night, she listened to the house settle, wind in the boards, Ezra's boots pacing the front room long after the boy slept. She knew that pacing. She'd heard it in her father's house the last winter before everything came apart. A man doing arithmetic that never came out right. Next morning, Ezra laid out her duties before finishing his coffee. Meals, washing, the boy. That's what I need. A line drawn in the dirt. Not unkindness, she understood, but a man protecting the one part of his life he still felt able to manage. And the rest of the house? Keep it standing. He went to the barn without further explanation. She kept it standing. Within 3 days, the mantel was clear, Caleb's shirts mended. She learned his habits by watching, the way she'd once learned cattle. He ate slowly when food was warm, quickly when it wasn't. He flinched at a wagon wheel on a road nothing had used. He counted things, fence posts, plates, the buttons on his shirt, touched one at a time before he'd put it on. Most mornings, a weathered, quiet hired man named Purdy came up from the bunkhouse to help with the herd, the only hand Ezra had kept on after the drought had forced him to let the rest go. Purdy said little, worked steadily, and treated Margaret's arrival with the same unbothered practicality he treated everything else on the ranch. On the 4th morning, carrying Wash toward the line, she passed the feed shed. The door had swung half open, and the smell reached her before she got close. Damp, sour, wrong for a shed full of dry hay. She didn't go in. It wasn't her place. She hung the wash and said nothing that evening, though she noticed Ezra ate less than his son, his eyes drifting again and again to the window facing the barn. It was Caleb who gave her the first real opening, without meaning to. On the 6th evening, she found him at the fence after his father had gone to check the herd, setting his stones down as cattle passed toward water. She sat a few feet off and watched, the way she'd watch any careful, private thing that didn't want an audience. When he'd finished, he pushed 2 stones apart from the rest. "Those 2 look different to you," she said quietly. He didn't answer, but he didn't scatter the stones either. After a moment, he glanced toward her, not quite meeting her eyes, but close. She held still, the way her father had taught her to hold still around a spooked horse. "Let it come to you." The gate creaked. 2 more cattle passed, thinner than the rest, ribs showing even in the dim light. Caleb set down 1 more stone, pushed it into the pair. 3 now, set apart from the herd. She looked at the cattle moving past, really looked, for the first time since arriving. Hip bones showing through dull coats. She understood, with the same cold certainty she'd once felt watching her own father's herd thin out, that this silent child had noticed something long before any adult on the ranch had said it aloud. She said nothing to Ezra that night. But she lay awake, thinking about the smell from the shed, and 3 stones a child had quietly set apart from all the rest. 2 days passed before she said anything, and even then Ezra chose the words first. She'd carried his coffee out on a frost-sharp morning and found him staring at the feed shed the way a man stares at a debt he hasn't opened the letter for. "Cattle are down again," he said, not quite to her. "Lost weight over summer, they won't get back before spring." "How many head do you have?" He glanced at her, surprised the question had come from the kitchen. 184, down from 260 before the drought. He said the number like a man reciting a fact he'd stopped feeling anything about. "And the hay's enough?" His face closed. "It'll do." She set the coffee down, ready to let it go, then didn't. "I walked past the feed shed. The door was open. I could smell it from the path. That's not house business." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." "I'm not telling you your business, Mr. Holcomb. I'm telling you what I smelled." She went back inside without watching whether he went to the shed. He went. She knew by evening his boots carried the smell in, and he ate almost nothing, and didn't meet her eyes across the table. Caleb noticed too, set down his fork, then pushed a piece of cornbread toward his father, a small kindness with no words attached. Ezra ate it, and something in his shoulders loosened. 3 days later he found her in the kitchen, flour on her hands. "You grew up on a ranch," he said, not quite a question. "I did." "Your family still work it?" "No, we lost it. Drought took the grass, same as yours, and my father waited too long. Kept telling himself the weather would turn." She pressed the dough flat. "It didn't. By the time he agreed to sell down the herd, there wasn't much worth selling, and the bank had already decided the rest." She didn't tell him about the year after. His slow decline, the fever, the empty house, the road she'd walked with 1 bag and nowhere to walk to. Not yet. How many head did he lose before he'd admit it was a problem? Enough that admitting it stopped being a choice. She looked up. "I've watched this exact season happen once, from the inside. I know what it looks like in the middle, before it's finished." He nodded once, unreadable, and went back to the barn. 2 mornings later, the shed door stood open, propped with a stone, and she saw him inside, pulling spoiled hay from the wall to dry in the sun, separating what could be saved. She said nothing and let him do it without an audience. That afternoon, Caleb followed her to the fence and began counting again. This time, separating the thin ones, he glanced up at her first. "3 again?" she asked. He shook his head, slowly. Deliberately. The first time he'd ever answered her with a no. "More than 3? He didn't nod. He didn't need to. He kept setting stones aside. 5, 6, 7, and she sat beside him in silence, understanding that the number in her chest and the number in his stone pile were both about to become impossible to keep ignoring. The count reached 11. Margaret carried the number with her, turning it over the way she used to turn her father's ledger pages, looking for arithmetic that might make it smaller. It didn't get smaller. The next day, with Ezra and Purdy out mending fence, she stepped inside the shed herself. She found 2 more soft patches near the back wall, where a long, unrepaired roof leak had done its damage. She pressed her palm against a bale and felt the wrongness of it. By the time she left, she had a number in her head that frightened her, because it wasn't her ranch, and she'd already learned once what happened to a family that found its numbers too late. She told him that night, after Caleb slept, "I think you should count your hay. Not guess, count it. I know what I've got. You know what you paid for. That's not the same as what's still good. You'd guess, you've been here 2 weeks. Long enough to watch your son separate 11 head from the herd with a handful of stones. He's not guessing either." That landed hard. Ezra sat with it a long moment. 11? As of yesterday. "I'll count the hay tomorrow," he said finally, and it cost him something to say it. It took 2 days. When he came in on the second evening, his face had the stillness of a man confirming what he most didn't want confirmed. 128, maybe 130, is what that hay carries to spring. Carrying 184 now. Then some of the herd needs to go before winter. Sold, not lost. That herd is what's left of what my wife and I built. Some came from her father's stock. You're talking about it like numbers on a page. I'm talking about it like numbers on a page because that's what decides whether any of it's standing come April. The room went still. I know what it costs to wait too long. I watched my father do it. Your family didn't keep its ranch, Ezra said, flat, a plain fact thrown up between them like a wall. The words landed exactly where they were meant to. Margaret sat very still, an old shame rising under her ribs, not because he was wrong, but because he wasn't. "No," she said quietly. "It didn't. And I buried him for it. He died a few months after we sold down the herd too late to matter. The worry wore him down faster than the fever that finally took him. Then the bank took the land anyway, because the debt was already too deep. I had no one left after that. No home either. So when I tell you to count your hay before December decides for you, I'm not guessing what happens if you don't. I already know." Ezra didn't answer right away. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "That wasn't fair." It was true, though. That doesn't make it unfair. Just hard to hear. He looked toward the boy's tin box on the shelf. 11 stones inside it. 184 can't stay 184, he said, mostly to himself. I think I've known that longer than I wanted to. For nearly a week, the number sat between them, unacted on. It was Purdy who forced it. "Bankman's coming Thursday," he told Ezra over coffee. "Comes every fall now. Counts what's standing in that pasture. Won't care whose stock it come from." That evening, Ezra came to her without waiting to be asked. "If I sell down to what the hay carries, I'm looking at near 60 head. Prices are low. I won't get half what they're worth in a fair season." "No, but you'll have cattle left to sell in a fair season, if enough of them live to see one." "Some of that herd came from Charlotte's father's stock," he said, his wife's name spoken aloud for the first time. "If I sell it off because I waited too long, I'm not just losing cattle, I'm losing what she built." What she built was a herd that could survive a hard year, not a fixed number of animals. I didn't know her, but I know what my father chose, and it wasn't that. He tried buying more hay first, rode to a neighbor's, came back empty-handed, the price too high with the note due in spring. 3 days later, a cold snap moved through early. He found 2 weakened animals down in the near pasture, unable to rise. One struggled upright before dark. The other did not rise until the following morning, even after hours beneath blankets with warm mash set before her. That was the morning the decision stopped being discussion. He rode to town and arranged the sale. 56 head, culled by weight and age. He kept back nearly every cow carrying a calf, even ones Purdy muttered should go. "Bank cares about the note," he told her. "But come spring, it's the calves that'll be worth anything. A dry cow's a mouth to feed. A bred cow's next year's chance." The bankman came Thursday. walked to pasture with a small ledger, and before he left, laid out the terms plainly. The note was secured against the land and the herd both, and the bank would expect a minimum payment by the 15th of May. Short of that, they'd begin proceedings to take the cattle held against it and the land behind them. It wasn't a threat, delivered the way he said it, just arithmetic. The same kind Ezra had learned to live inside all winter. Ezra stood straighter after the wagon left anyway, like a held breath finally out. The number at least now fixed instead of floating. That night, the herd settled at 128. He turned a pencil over without writing. Have to put some of this toward the shed roof. Rest toward hay and grain for the weak ones. Won't leave much for the note itself. He looked up. Keep thinking I ought to feel like I've solved something. Mostly I feel like I've traded a worse winter for a harder spring. That's usually what it feels like, Margaret said, right up until spring comes, and you find out which one you'd rather have had. Winter tightened around Salt Creek slowly. The herd stayed close to the barn now, 128 instead of the number that once ranged the far pasture. Margaret found a rhythm in those weeks she hadn't expected to feel again after her father's ranch. Not ease, but order, everyone trusting the others to hold their part. It was Ezra who first bent the line he'd drawn that first afternoon. Late November, Caleb woke with a fever, breathing quick and shallow. Ezra saddled the horse himself and rode for the doctor 11 miles off without asking what she needed. The fever broke by afternoon. That evening, without announcement, Ezra sat with his son himself, reading from an old almanac in a low voice, while Margaret finally ate a meal she'd had no time for since breakfast. "You don't have to earn a night off," she told him after. "Just noticed you've had the boy every hour since you got here, on top of the house, on top of whatever I've needed about the herd. That's not what I hired you for." He turned his hat in his hands. "Some days, when you're out walking the pasture with me, I ought to be the one minding him. Seems only fair." It came in small, uneven pieces after that, not a clean division, but a shape that shifted according to what the day required. Some days Margaret did nearly everything. Other days Ezra minded the boy through a long afternoon while she helped Purdy inventory the shed. It was no longer her job and his job. It had become, without either naming it, the work of the house. Caleb noticed before either adult said anything. He began, in early December, bringing his tin box to the kitchen table instead of keeping it always at the fence, setting his stones out while Margaret cooked and Ezra worked his ledger, the three of them in a silence that had stopped feeling like absence. It was around then that Margaret finally asked about the flinch, the way Caleb went still at the sound of a wagon wheel, even one that never came near the house. Ezra was quiet a long moment before he answered. He was in the wagon with her. The axle broke on the grade above the creek. I found him underneath the overturned seat, close enough to have his hand in hers. He didn't look up from the ledger. He hasn't spoken since. Margaret said nothing right away. It explained more than the flinch. Why he watched doors, why he needed to see her the whole time she worked, why a boy who trusted almost nothing still trusted a count he could hold in his own hands. One such evening, not long after, Ezra finally asked the question he'd been circling for weeks. "What happened to your mother?" "Fever. Same as most people out here lose someone to. I don't remember her well. Mostly I remember my father after. How quiet the house got." She kept kneading. "I think that's part of why he couldn't bear to sell the herd in the end. It was the last thing that still looked like the life they'd built. Selling it felt like losing her twice." Ezra set his pencil down. "I understand that better than I'd like to. I know you do. I haven't asked about the north room. I didn't think it was my place." "It isn't, particularly. But I don't mind that you haven't asked. You've let me keep it mine." He turned the pencil once. "I noticed that, too." She only nodded, and the kneading filled the silence, and across the table Caleb set another stone in its row. One of the last easy evenings, though none of them yet knew it, before the sky over Salt Creek turned strange and still in the final week of February. By then, 6 of the weakest animals had been lost through the hard middle of winter, despite the smaller herd and careful rationing. Found down in the pasture on cold mornings, 1 and 2 at a time. No single loss dramatic enough to mark, all of them adding up. Caleb's stone count, kept faithfully through every week of it, stood at 122. The stillness came first. For most of a day, the wind simply stopped, and the cattle turned their backs to the western ridge, and small birds vanished from the fence wire. "Going to be a bad one," Ezra said, and set the ranch to work. Purdy reinforced the near pen. Margaret sealed every gap in the house. Ezra rode the fence line twice, counting the herd against Caleb's last count. Caleb counted his stones 3 times that afternoon instead of once, as if some part of him already knew the number might not hold. The storm arrived faster than judged, snow driving sideways within a quarter hour. A portion of the herd still needed moving to the windbreak pen. "Purdy and I can get 'em," Ezra said, already pulling his coat on. "I'll help with the stragglers," Margaret said. "Caleb can't come out in this." Ezra hesitated, an old fear crossing his face. Neither said aloud. "The tool shed," Margaret said. "Close, out of the wind, and I can see the house the whole time. He won't be alone." He didn't like it, but there was no better answer in the yard. He helped her wrap Caleb in blankets and settle him on clean sacking, lantern low, tin box held to his chest. "I'll be right there," she told him, hands steady on his shoulders, though her heart wasn't. "I'll stay where you can see the barn door. I'll come back after every pass." She and Ezra worked the near pasture together, pulling the last stragglers through while Purdy held the gate. By the time the last animal was through, her hands had gone past cold into numb. She found Caleb exactly where she'd left him, counting. He shook his head, slow, deliberate. The motion she'd learned meant certainty. He pushed his stones into 2 groups, the many and a cluster of 12 set apart. Then he pointed toward the north pasture, swallowed in blowing snow. She ran for the barn. 12 short, she told Ezra and Purdy. Caleb counted. North pasture. "He's sure?" "He's sure." Ezra swore low. "Fence up there's been soft since November, meant to reset it." He was already moving for a fresh horse. Margaret caught his arm. "I'll come." "No." His eyes found hers. "Caleb needs someone who won't leave the second things get hard. That's you." "It's always been you. Since the porch. Since you told me you'd care for him. I need you to stay with my son." She stepped back. "The stones. Let him show you which direction first." Ezra crossed to the shed with her. Caleb pointed again, more precisely. Not simply north, but toward the low corner where the fence always sagged worst. "That's exactly where I'd have looked," Ezra said, and thanked him, plain and direct, before he and Purdy vanished into the white. The low corner gave up nothing. Sagging fence, empty drifted pasture, no fresh tracks. They pushed further until the horses balked at a drift too deep and turned back to regroup. Margaret was already moving toward them when they reached the barn's lee side. "Low corner's clear," Ezra said, breathing hard. "No cattle. Whatever gap they went through, it wasn't the one I pictured." Caleb pushed past her, grabbed a fistful of his father's sleeve, his small face tight with something past fear. Ezra crouched immediately. "Caleb, what is it?" The boy's mouth worked, silent, the way it always did when words tried to come and something older held them back. Margaret knelt beside them. "Show him, Caleb. However you can. Take your time." Caleb let go of his father's sleeve and pointed instead, back toward the low corner they'd already searched, his arms shaking with cold and urgency both. Ezra followed the gesture and frowned. "We already looked there, son. There's nothing." He started to turn back toward the horses, already reasoning past the boy's fear as nothing more than fear. Caleb grabbed the sleeve again, harder this time, refusing to let him turn away. The wind screamed past the barn corner. Ezra stopped and knelt back down, and this time he waited. Then, cracked and small, unmistakably clear, "North Gate." Ezra went absolutely still. Caleb pulled at his sleeve again, pointing toward a different stretch of fence entirely. "The north gate," Ezra repeated, understanding arriving fast. "Not the low fence, the actual gate. That latch has been loose for weeks. I kept meaning to fix it." He stood abruptly. They wouldn't have drifted to the low corner at all. They'd have gone straight through, out toward the drainage cut. "You knew," Margaret said to Caleb, "before any of this." Caleb nodded once, still holding his father's sleeve, as if letting go might undo the words he'd just spoken for the first time in 8 months. Ezra knelt and took his son's shoulders in his hands. "Thank you," he said, voice breaking slightly, not from cold. He pulled the boy into a rough, brief embrace, then was up again, calling for Purdy, calling for fresh horses. It was nearly 2 hours before the horses returned. They'd found 9 of the 12 at the drainage cut, huddled against a cut bank that had broken the worst of the wind. 3 they never found that night. 1 they wouldn't find at all until the thaw. But 9 were 9, saved because a boy who hadn't spoken in 8 months had found, in the middle of the worst storm Salt Creek had seen in years, exactly 2 words that mattered more than any he might have spoken before. Ezra came into the shed well past midnight, ice thick in his beard, and found his son asleep against Margaret's side. "9 back," he said quietly. "Lost 3. 9 is not nothing, not tonight." He rested a hand lightly on his son's hair. "First thing he said since his mother died, and it was to save cattle." He looked at Margaret. "I believed him completely. I don't think I've trusted anything that fast in a long while." The storm broke on the 3rd day, all at once, leaving a silence so complete Margaret woke certain something was wrong before she understood it was only quiet. 119 head remained where 122 had entered the storm. Not triumph, not quite loss either. Simply the cost of a hard season paid in winter's only currency. Caleb didn't wake transformed. He retreated again into watchful silence for 2 days, as if those 2 words had cost him something he needed time to recover. Margaret didn't push. Trust, once broken by loss, rebuilt itself on its own schedule. 3 days after the storm, Ezra found him in the barn doorway and asked, without expectation, "Come help with the morning feed?" Caleb hesitated then, barely more than breath given shape. "Pa." Ezra went still over the feed bucket. 2 days after that, watching the herd file past, Caleb said clearly, 12. Then, after a moment, correcting himself with his old precision, 9 came back. By February, he had a dozen words, mostly practical. Enough. More. Cold. Tired. And once, watching Margaret work dough, unprompted, good. She had to turn away a moment before she trusted her voice. The bank's letter came in March, acknowledging the fall payment against the note and restating the terms Whitfield had given in the pasture. The 15th of May, the minimum still owed. Not forgiveness, not relief. A debt not erased, only not yet called due in full. "Have to sell some of the yearlings to make it," Ezra said, going back over his figures at the table. "Calves are strong this spring. Cows we kept came through better than I'd any right to expect." He looked at her. "Wasn't luck that did that. Wasn't only you either." No, it wasn't. Ground thawed through late March. One afternoon at the feed shed, Ezra found her there and, without much preamble, held out a small iron key. "For the shed. You keep it. I've got my own." She understood what it meant beyond its plain function, that she no longer needed his permission to see what wanted doing. "Thank you," she said, closing her hand around it. "Don't thank me for giving you something that was already yours to have." By the middle of May, Ezra had sold off a dozen yearlings and 2 of the older steers and rode into town with the money folded inside his coat. He came back that evening with a signed receipt instead of a cleared account. The minimum paid, the rest of the note extended through fall, Whitfield satisfied enough by the state of the herd and the strength of the spring calves to grant it. It wasn't a debt erased. It was a debt they'd bought another season to carry. Ezra set the receipt on the table where Margaret could see it and said nothing more about it than that, because, by then, There was nothing more that needed saying. That evening, Caleb set his tin box on the table beside her planting figures, opened it, the same worn stones inside. "Tomorrow," he said, slow and careful. "We count again?" She looked at this boy who had found his voice not in comfort, but in crisis, through nothing she'd done to fix him but the plain fact of someone staying close enough, long enough, to be worth speaking to when it mattered. "Tomorrow," she agreed. "We'll count." Outside, the herd moved across the greening pasture, smaller than it had been, harder won, but alive, carrying next year's calves. Salt Creek had not come through the winter unmarked. It had lost cattle, lost certainty, lost the easy belief that hard work alone was ever enough. But it stood, holding exactly what wisdom had ever promised anyone on that hard land. Not everything, but enough, and the people who had stayed to see if it held.